right, welcome everyone. We're very lucky to have Marcus du Sautoy here with us today. Marcus is the Simonyi Professor for the Public Understanding of Science and Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University. Marcus is the author of 7 books and 2 plays, including I Is a Strange Loop, in which he stars as lead actor. He has worked with a variety of art organizations, making science alive for the public, and he has presented numerous radio and TV series, including a 4-part series for the BBC called The Story of Maths. Marcus received an Order of the British Empire in 2010 and was also made a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2016. Welcome, Marcus. So I thought maybe we'd start out with you telling us a little bit more about your background. So you're a mathematician. I've also been an academic mathematician, so I can say with confidence that mathematicians aren't exactly known for their broader participation in the arts and society. So you're a clear counterexample. Maybe tell us how you got involved in so many things, math and art, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting because somehow at school I was always very passionate about the arts. I started learning the trumpet when I was about 12 or 13, did a lot of theatre. I enjoyed kind of performance, but I also really enjoyed the world of science, the power of science to tell us where we come from, where we're going to go next, to really understand the universe. And what I found was that mathematics was this perfect bridge between the two, because certainly mathematics is the language of science, helps us to articulate what we're seeing around us. But the other side, I saw that mathematics are actually very creative, that sometimes you could make geometries, for example, that don't match what we see around us physically, create number systems that were kind of their own world. So I really saw that mathematics was this perfect place for me to kind of bridge my desire to have a language to understand the universe, but also to have a language that I could also be a little bit more creative in. And I think there was a book that my maths teacher at my school here in England recommended to me, which showed me that this subject was this perfect bridge. And it's one any mathematicians probably know out there. It's called A Mathematician's Apology by G.H. Hardy. And this is a great number theorist. G.H. Hardy worked with Ramanujan, so some people might have seen the film about their relationship. But he wrote this lovely book about what it meant for him to be a mathematician. And he always said, mathematics for me is a creative art, not a useful science. Actually, he was very dismissive of the kind of mathematics that we use in engineering. So that's not real mathematics. So that book for me sort of opened my eyes to the creative side of being a mathematician, and made me realize, this would be the perfect subject to kind of bridge those two passions I have for creative arts, but also for a world of logic and science.
Interesting. Actually, now that you brought up Hardy's book, I don't know how Hardy would think about the applications of mathematics today. And certainly, I don't know if you were alive, what he would think of all the applications today, certainly in machine learning and whatnot. But you've written popular books. I don't know if that would be sacrilegious to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this book, in some ways, its opening sentence is, "It is a melancholy experience for a professional mathematician to find himself writing about mathematics. The job of a mathematician is to prove theorems, not to talk about them." So, in some ways, that has always been a sentence which I think many mathematicians have lived under the cloud of this sentence, saying, okay, I shouldn't raise my head above the parapet and sort of talk about mathematics beyond our seminars. But in some ways, Hardy was a perfect counterexample to that, because he was a great communicator. He wrote a lot of great papers, books, articles, trying to communicate maths to the general public. So I think it took me a little time actually to feel brave enough to actually start sharing my stories more widely beyond the mathematical community. But I think it's come at a time. I sort of started writing articles for the Times newspaper here in London. It's kind of mid-90s. And actually it was at a time when science wasn't communicating much with the public, and it caused a lot of kind of scare stories, because the public just suddenly had this new science foisted on them, GM crops, stem cells, for example. And there was a lot of, the trust in scientists somehow started to vanish because there wasn't any communication. So actually, my funding body at the time was the Royal Society. I had this wonderful 10-year fellowship from the Royal Society to do research. And when I started putting my head above the parapet and writing articles for the newspaper, eventually writing some books, doing radio, they were very encouraging and said, yes, actually, we need to change the climate. This should be part of a professional scientist's job, is not just to do their fundamental research, but actually to communicate with society about the importance of it, the impact of it. So I think there's been a real climate change in the world of science, which means that this is now really genuinely part of our job, and an important part of our job, to make sure that society understands the impact, for example, machine learning is going to have. So I was on a committee at the Royal Society with Demis Hassabis and various others, where we looked at the impact that this new technology is going to have, and tried to forward scope such that society will be aware and be able to make decisions about legal issues of the way machine learning will be used, rather than it suddenly arriving as a completed project in a few years' time, and then people being very nervous of it. So the climate has changed. And also, as you say, Hardy, I think, would be really surprised at the sort of applications that the mathematics he loved, for example, prime numbers, the discoveries that we've made about prime numbers, absolutely key, of course, to internet cryptography. So I think that division between pure and applied mathematics that he lived with really has vanished. So there's so much more fluidity between these subjects that I think there's really no point talking about that division really anymore.
Oh, I see. Although actually, I suppose in the ivory tower that distinction still exists, but that's a very particular place in the
Well,
world. Right?
I think it's beginning to vanish. So, yeah, sure. I mean, I spent some time working in Cambridge, and there, they have the Department of Pure Maths and Mathematical Statistics, and the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics. But honestly, those two are now talking to each other in a way that they didn't in the past. So I think, although there might be formally some still titles of that division, the more we actually share our stories, the more we realize that a mathematician with insights into topology will have big impacts on trying to understand neuroscience in the brain, for example. So I think that's one of the things I'm very passionate about in my job as the professor for the public understanding of science in Oxford, is actually not just between pure and applied maths, but across all the sciences, that we really need to share our stories more and break down the barriers between these departments. So anything that can facilitate dialogue between the biology department and mathematics. We have a very strong maths and biology team now in Oxford, which is realizing, wow, the challenges we've got in biology, there are lots of interesting tools we have in maths which are unexpectedly helpful for gaining insights in biological systems.
That's great. Yeah. Maybe we can pivot to talking about two of your most recent books. How did you get interested in AI? Yeah, right, exactly, right. So your first book, The Creativity Code, came out a few years ago, and then I think the Shortcuts and Better Thinking, that came out last year, if I'm not mistaken. Or
Yeah,
was it
last year, exactly.
last year? Yeah, yeah. So how did you actually first get interested in AI, and then proceed to even write a book about it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, partly it was being on this committee at the Royal Society that drew me into the extraordinary phase change that I think has happened in the way that code is being written. I mean, we've been through so many AI winters, decades of AI winters, and I think this idea of top-down code where we write instructions and then the machines implemented at speed and depth. There's been such a change, and I realized that this was such an exciting moment where, with machine learning, deep learning, that the code is being written in a much more bottom-up manner, which is giving real new possibilities. So I usually hate being on committees. I probably shouldn't admit that, but this was one committee that I really looked forward to turning up to every time we met, because we would get experts in from different fields to talk about the impact of machine learning on driverless cars, for example, and what the legal status will be if an accident occurs, the impact on medical issues. So it was a really exciting committee to be on. Great people like Demis and others. So it was a real privilege to be there. And I began to realize, wow, this new kind of coding is having a massive impact on many technologies. But what I was interested, coming back actually to your first question about my interest in the creative arts, I did feel like, well, that's interesting because our creativity and our creative arts, we regard as something which is uniquely human, an expression of our kind of emotional world, our conscious world, an exploration of what's going on in our consciousnesses and others. Surely that's somewhere where AI will not be able to have much of an impact. But I got somewhat of a surprise. And I think, the story starts with DeepMind's great success with the game of Go, because I think that, it's not a story where we're surprised by computers beating us at games, but I think what was really exciting for me was seeing what many regard now as the first creative act by Bytecode, which was this move 37 in game 2, now celebrated as an extraordinary new sort of move. But for me, this move was very important. It was a very unusual move made by DeepMind in very early on in the game. Most Go players would, your Go master would slap your wrist if you made this move. Yet AlphaGo was able to show why this move had great value later on in the game. And for me, this was interesting because it passed 3 tests of another member of the committee, Margaret Bowden, who's been, she's a cognitive scientist looking at the impact of kind of computers in the world of creativity. And she has a nice definition of what she thinks we should regard as something which is creative. So it's something which is new, something which is surprising, and something which has value. So that's quite interesting because new things you can judge quite objectively, but surprise is something about emotions. And that move 37 was surprising because I remember watching these live on YouTube and all the commentators kind of gasping at what a bad move it was. So it certainly, caused people to have an emotional reaction. It made people look, oh, what's going on here? And then ultimately, games are nice because you can judge value. Does it win or lose you the game? So I think that's exciting. It is a creative move in terms of Margaret Bowden's definition, but also the point was this was not a line of code that was written by a human. It was a line of code which merged out of the learning process of AlphaGo and the games that it looked at, human games, the synthetic games it made. So I think it genuinely deserves to be called the creativity of the code rather than the humans that originally coded it. And I think that's what's exciting. The machine learning, you can see, has the possibility for very new things to emerge out of that learning process, things which you're not expecting, things which are quite hard to explain, things which are surprising and, could have value. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So if it can be creative in the, tight confines of a game, it's black and white pixels. What about something more broadly? So the book looks at the impact that this new technology has had, and Google has certainly been very involved in many of the projects, looking at visual arts, music, the written word. But also one of the strong stories in the book is, what about mathematics? Because as you said at the beginning, I chose mathematics because of its creativity. And, I've always regarded mathematics as something I didn't think a computer could do, because it isn't just about turning a handle of, the logical consequences of something. It is about creativity, imagination, intuition, leaping into the unknown. As you know, when you did your research, ideas, where do those ideas come from? They are very creative. So one of the strands of the book is, okay, how close are mathematicians to being put out of a job by machine learning? Could machine learning do mathematics? So that was somehow the launch pad for this book, exploring all of those kind of stories that were emerging over the last 5 years.
See, I forget actually what was your opinion going into the book, because I don't know if you have a revised opinion now, because certainly much progress has been made all throughout machine learning, but also in particular mathematics.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, classically we've had things like mathematics do verification, but that's very different than coming up with proofs in a creative way, right? So there's the four-color
Yes.
graph theorem. There's also Hales's work on sphere packing. But that's a very different flavor than sort of the kinds of theorem proving that people want. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yes,
Well,
exactly.
what
So,
were your thoughts going into it, and what are your thoughts today?
Yeah, Tim, you're actually absolutely right. The computer has been involved in us doing mathematics, interestingly, for decades. But you're absolutely right. The sort of style is sort of checking, a finite but very large and tedious number of cases, which computer is great at. That was the four-color map problem. So yes, I've seen it as a kind of useful kind of cranking machine. But yeah, so going into the book, I was skeptical whether it could actually come up with exciting mathematical proofs, because I sort of compare proofs a little bit to like telling stories. So I think proof and narrative. I did an event with a novelist, Ben Ockery, here, sort of exploring how close a connection there is between telling a story in a novel and actually a proof, because I think that a lot of people outside of mathematics think that we mathematicians are basically trying to prove all the true statements about numbers and geometry. Sort of like if anyone knows Borges's Library of Babel, in that short story, the library contains every single book that it's possible to write. And at first sight, that looks like it's got everything. But actually, you realize as you read the story that it's actually got nothing in there because nobody's made any choices. So choice is really an important part of doing mathematics. We choose those theorems that we want to share with our seminars because it emotionally engages us. There's some really strange connection. Primes on division by 4 which have remainder 1 can be written as the sum of 2 squares. I mean, what on earth has those got to do with each other? And then you get taken on a journey, the Fermat's wonderful discovery of these connections. So my feeling was, okay, if AI is going to be able to kind of be able to do mathematics, it's got to learn what kind of moves us, what emotionally engages us. And so, of course, you could give it all of our mathematics. I mean, how do we learn what we like? We study the theorems and we sort of get excited by the theorems of Fermat and Gauss. So it isn't, it's possible that the AI could learn that. But what I saw, and I sat next to Demis at this in this meeting, and we actually both got elected to be fellows of the Royal Society about the same time. And I kind of joked to him and said, hey, well, how long is it before you're going to have a piece of AI elected for having proved a great theorem in mathematics to the Royal Society? And he said, watch this space. So I actually went in and I saw some of the work they were doing early on, but it was more about computer proofs, which are a slightly different quality to kind of human proofs. And it was certainly getting a taste that by learning about computer proofs in the past, it certainly was generating some a really degree more load of those proofs, but most of them were uninteresting and most of them didn't resonate for me. So when I wrote the book, I didn't see any evidence of exciting things happening. And I think, these sort of books can go out of date quite quickly. And I think actually this book has stood up quite well to a lot of the different advances. There are things like DALL-E now, generating images from word generation. But I think actually the book contains enough stories that cover most of the bases. So even if there are developments, I feel that what GPT-3, for example, that wasn't there to talk about, but I talk about text generation in the book as well at early stages of that. The one story I would love to put in, and it's the one, Tim, I know you actually talked a little bit about in videos, is an amazing kind of involvement of machine learning in making some new mathematical breakthroughs, which DeepMind was involved in, which was announced in, I think, December, was it, in Nature, the paper?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, so for people who don't know, basically researchers at DeepMind and researchers at Oxford and maybe another university
in Australia, I think.
Australia, basically used AI for theorem proving assistance. So in some sense that was quite different because it's not. I think people have this very binary sense of, okay, it's either just doing verification or it has to be this creative whiz. but it was a hybrid, right? And there, that's interesting because it's actually a very interesting relationship to what you talked about in terms of the choice of problems, right? Because you can feed machine learning a lot of data, but it's for right now, for what we know, it's doing pattern recognition, but it doesn't have maybe taste necessarily, which is coming from the external world. And so there was like this interesting symbiosis between sort of the choice of the human mathematicians and then the sort of the pattern recognition of the machine. I don't know how you think about that symbiotic relationship.
Well, what was very striking to me is that, and where I could see suddenly why this would be a very powerful tool for mathematicians, is the machine learning didn't come up with new proofs, the kind of analytic understanding of why there was a connection. What it came up with is new connections that we hadn't spotted in the kind of data. So, for example, it might spot what kind of the key thing that might be helping us to generate an understanding of knots in knot theory, or in I think the other breakthrough was in representation theory. It sort of spotted a new sort of connection, and that, you see, is really exciting, because I think there are two kind of roles for being a research mathematician. One is getting new insights about new conjectures and new connections. And the second one is proving those. So, for example, the Riemann hypothesis is a great discovery that Riemann made, that to understand prime numbers, we need to understand the zeros of the Riemann zeta function. Now it's up to one of us to try and prove that his hunch about what this connection says is actually true. But that first insight about a new connection is really valuable, and sometimes the greatest contribution of and the kind of real creativity in finding something new. And this is what I think we saw in this collaboration. The humans gave it things that they thought were interesting and might have connections. And of course, what is machine learning very good at? It's very good at spotting underlying patterns where sometimes, our embodiment, it's very difficult to see it. I mean, I often compare it a bit to like Galileo getting a telescope and suddenly seeing deep into the solar system. This is sort of giving us a telescope into looking deeper into data and perhaps picking up patterns. And the challenge then is, is that pattern genuine, or is it misleading us? And that's the role that then the human mathematician, is still very good at coming in. And so we saw in this collaboration, the humans then saying, that's a really interesting new conjecture. I never thought of that connection between the two, and then going on to prove that connection. So I think that's where we might see really exciting things. I don't see yet evidence of the AI being so good at coming up with really good analytic understanding of why, doing the why. They're spotting the what, but maybe the why is still. But I don't think it'll be too long, and I'll tell you why. Because in the visual world, as a species, we've been sort of inundated with visuals for millions and millions of years of our evolution, and so the brain has become highly developed in a visual way to interpret, and also oral music, for example. But as mathematicians, we're still very young as a species. We really only started doing mathematics, a couple of thousand years ago with Euclid's Elements, and everything kicks off then. And actually, we don't, as a species, we haven't spent much time in this world of mathematics compared to the time we spend in the world around us. So I think that's why, often you see young kids becoming very mature mathematically, because they immerse themselves in this world and can get a kind of be older than their age in mathematics as compared to anything else. So I don't see why an AI can't kind of be exposed to all the theorems that we regard as worthy of exploration and start to pick up the style that we like, the kind of thought process. After all, how do we end up being able to be mathematicians? We end up being mathematicians by exposing ourselves to the world of mathematics. And since, in a way, I think that's still very young kind of subject in the great scheme of things, I don't see why an AI couldn't somehow take all of mathematics and start to get a feel for it. You see, I think it's very different from, and this is one of the problems about creativity in other areas. An AI can read all of literature. You can give it all of the books. And in a way, GPT-3 is trained on a huge, great big back catalogue of human writing. But there's writing isn't just about words. Writing is also about all of the other things which impact on our culture. So it's about our history, our culture, our visual world. All of these things impact on what the meanings of those words are, and that's why these Winograd challenges, which are always the ones that catch out the AI in a Turing test. These Winograd challenges are sentences with ambiguity in them. And humans are able to fill in the ambiguity because we understand the context of a word and because of the history and the culture. And the AI isn't being fed that. It's just being fed basically lots more books. And it might pick that up. But you see, I think that's why mathematics is more of a self-contained world. It's a bit like Go, because Go, that the game of Go doesn't have the impact of other things on it. It is a sort of self-contained world in a way. So mathematics, yeah, sure, mathematics. Well, maybe that's not true. I mean, because why do we like certain sorts of mathematics? Because it helps us understand the universe around us. So maybe there is more about the impact of maths sitting inside a physical universe, which means that we're more interested in certain types of mathematics as opposed to others. So maybe machine learning, if it's going to become a mathematician, needs to have the its idea of its place in the physical universe. Maybe it needs music as well, because I use a lot of music to stimulate my mathematics, and I feel that connection is very strong. And maybe my creativity in mathematics is a reflection of my creativity in other areas. So yeah, maybe the AI will need to be general AI before it really becomes a good mathematician.
Interesting. Maybe this is a good place to pivot to your second book on shortcuts, because I know I picked this up too, and I'm glad to have confirmed this when we spoke previously. But one of the motivations for writing your second book was that perhaps shortcuts are a way for humans to still salvage some of their power over machines, right? Because right now, neural networks, they're not very parsimonious. They take a lot of energy and compute to train. And then even when at inference time, they use this for the standard models, they expend the same amount of computation for each input, right? Whereas we're selective about our attention and how much energy we want to allocate to different tasks. So maybe why don't you tell us a little bit about your shortcuts book and how you're thinking about that, and specifically in regards to AI.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, so the inspiration for this book actually came from an interview that I did with a journalist at the Guardian newspaper here in England, and we were talking about the AI book. And by the end of the interview, he was sort of so depressed. He said, "What's left for humanity? It seems like if it can write music and poetry, sure, is there anything left for us?" So I needed to cheer him up some way and to think, well, yeah. So what is our unique strength as a species over AI? And I think in some ways, I think our laziness is our saving grace, because actually as humans, we don't like doing a lot of hard work. I mean, I think laziness is often thought of as one of the deadly sins, but I don't think it's a sin at all. I think it's a really it's a superpower, because you go, okay, this just looks like a heck of a lot of hard work. Let me just take a step backwards and see if there's a back door into a different way of thinking about this. And actually it was one of the reasons I fell in love with maths, because I was a lazy teenager, and my maths teacher told us this wonderful story about Carl Friedrich Gauss finding this clever way to add up the numbers from 1 to 100. The teacher had set this task to the class, and the rest of the class were doing it like a computer would, adding 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, taking ages to do it, probably make lots of mistakes. But Gauss had seen this clever way of using, 100 plus 1 is 101, 99 plus 2 is 101, 98 plus 3, 101. So he saw that there were 50 pairs of numbers adding up to 101 and got the answer, so quickly. And I remember thinking, oh, that's amazing when I heard that story. And my teacher said, well, this is what mathematics is about. It's in some sense, it's the art of the shortcut. Rather than doing a load of hard work, we've over 2,000 years come up with these clever ways to look at a problem and go, okay, no, there's a stupid way to do that, a long, hard, boring way. but maybe there's a cleverer way to think about it. So so this book was kind of my, the what humanity has over the machine at the moment is our ability to come up with these cunning shortcuts. So it's a sort of celebration of my subject of mathematics, the shortcuts that we've come up with over 2,000 years, the power of looking for a pattern, or calculus as a shortcut to narrow in on the optimal solutions to things, or the idea of statistics. What's the data shortcut? How much data do you need to look at? So it was so I think that these shortcuts are really what we're very good at. Humans are just lazy. Babe Ruth, for example, why was he such a great hitter of home runs? He admitted I'm really lazy. I hate walking around running around the bases. That's too much work. So I just hit the ball out of the park and then just kind of stroll around. So I think laziness should be celebrated as one of our superpowers.
Well, I suppose if the AI is going to start doing everything for us, maybe we'll just become more lazy, although hopefully in a good way.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. This book on shortcuts, in a way, it's trying to avoid doing work, but on the other hand, work gives us a lot of value. So I mean, I choose to do mathematics every day, or write my books, for example, because I enjoy that work. So so the book is actually not trying to stop us doing work, because I think a lot of us do our work because we love the work that we do. So, and there's a very interesting distinction that Aristotle made between two different sorts of work. So he had proesis, which is work for a goal. So that you're just really interested in the product and you don't care how you get there. So shortcuts are going to be really great for that, because you want to get to the goal. But there's also praxis, which is work for its own sake, the work that we enjoy doing. I could press a button, get a machine to make a chair for me, but actually I might want to spend the time carving the chair out of wood, and that will be work, but it's work that I choose to do. So the book is sort of a set of shortcuts to get you to your goals, so you do what you want to do. So yeah, and I talked to various other people in different disciplines about their relationship to shortcuts, whether there are shortcuts in their area. But one of them was Robert McFarlane, who's a great walker. And he's written wonderful books about walking. And I was interested, shortcut surely is anathema to him, because he wants to spend days getting to the top of a mountain, and he's enjoying doing that work. If there was a helicopter that take him to the top, he wouldn't be interested in that. So I think it's interesting that our relationship to work was sort of partly what I was exploring in this book. What work do we want to avoid doing, or what work do we actually enjoy doing? So I mean, people often ask me, is there a shortcut to coming up to shortcuts? And actually, I don't think there is. We actually have spent a long time, and I spent doing my maths a long time trying to find that clever way to come to the solution to a problem. But once it's there, then it's a shortcut that can be used by generations going forward. So often we take the long way, and often we have to take weird detours in order to get to the shortcuts that eventually sort of ended up in this book. So
right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I understand that you're now working on another book, which is supposed to be another counterpoint yet to this idea of a shortcut. So what exactly is that? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, well, my other big passion is, and I'm sure many of your colleagues share this, is for games. So I love collecting games wherever I go around the world, because I'm interested, what games are kind of universal, what games are particular to a different culture. And so the book's called Around the World in 80 Games. So games are kind of interesting because in some ways they're about putting up artificial barriers. What's the shortcut for snakes and ladders? Well, I could just move my counter from the beginning to the end square, but we put these weird constraints on ourselves that we have to go by the throw of the dice, and we have to be dictated by going down a snake. So it's kind of, games are a slightly weird activity for placing barriers in our way, which then actually, when we play the game, of course, we are sort of looking for the best way. Snakes and ladders, obviously you don't have any control over snakes and ladders, but other games, of course, you do have a role in planning your strategy, and you will try and find the kind of shortcut through these obstacles. So there's a kind of interesting tension that this book has drawn out, which is, games, I think, are a little good example of that kind of work that we enjoy doing for its own sake. So we set up this weird confines of, 19 by 19 grid, which we're putting black and white stones down on. But we're enjoying spending the 2 hours bound by these constraints. And the kind of thesis of the book is that games and mathematics share a huge amount in common. So for me, I'm actually, in my research, I'm a number theorist and a group theorist. And group theory is about understanding symmetry. And one of the things I love about group theory is that we have this very simple set of rules for what makes a symmetrical object. Yet from those simple rules, a huge complex world emerges. And I think that's the quality of a really good game. One you understand very quickly because the rules are very simple. Yet when you play it, there's so many different varieties and ways to play the game. So I would say almost games are a way of kind of playing mathematics. Somebody once said that games are like operas built from bridges. So there's kind of a creativity of the story of the game, whether there is one, but it needs to have a mathematical kind of underpinning to make sure the rules make sense, give rise to interesting gameplay. And of course, once there are mathematical rules at play in a game, understanding that mathematics will give you an edge when you play the game. So I'm hoping the book's going to also provide people with cunning ways to play games against their fellow gamers and give them a little bit of an edge.
Interesting. That's I'm just speaking for myself personally, because when I look at myself, I don't know if I would call myself that interested in games per se. I always was more interested in math, sort of in this relationship with physics and finding the whatever the laws of the universe, so to speak, as opposed to this sort of thinking about it in terms of a game. I guess actually Hilbert famously said that he thought mathematics was just sort of a game in which you're playing with symbols. I don't know. That maybe that makes it mathematics a bit dry, but I think you're probably thinking of a game in a more rich, fun sense.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, but you're right, because there is a quality where, well, I think a lot of I think my wife, for example, doesn't understand playing games at all, because she's a psychologist. She's very embedded in the world around her with people, and of course, gaming is about actually sharing time around a sort of a campfire almost. But I think there's a quality of games where you're weirdly removing yourself to a very different world of Dungeons and Dragons, for example. You create this artificial world, within which you can explore kind of interesting elements of your psychology, for example. And I think that's why games often for introverts are a very safe place to actually maybe share their emotional world. So I think they play a powerful role, but I think they have that sort of quality. You're right. I think there are some mathematicians who are only interested in the maths if it helps them understand the physical universe around them. My son was a bit like that. He went off to do physics at university, and he said, "Dad, I just don't get what you're doing, because you're spending all your time creating these weird symmetrical objects in high dimensional space, which aren't useful for anything. I mean, ultimately they might be. That's how we get funding. I'm excited by these discoveries because I think they're tapping into fundamental truths of the universe. Whether they actually have physical realizations, perhaps less important for me. I mean, I'm a big believer that I think, that our universe is a physicalized piece of mathematics. Take Max Tegmark's kind of idea.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
Yeah, I really, why are we seeing maths everywhere? I think it is because somehow this is a physicalized bit of maths, and that probably means, if there are multiverses, then probably another one realizes different bits of maths. So I think, and the maths, you see, the physical world needs a moment of creation and a moment of mathematics doesn't need that. That's one of its joys. I think it exists outside of time. It is about structure and the interrelationship of patterns and structure and therefore is why you keep on seeing it, in the physical universe, but also in the arts as well. I think that's why. I mean, I do a lot of work with composers and musicians. I set up a centre in Manchester at the Royal Northern College of Music. It's called PRISM, which stands for Practice and Research in Science and Music. And I think the reason that we have such a wonderful kind of dialogue at this centre is because mathematics, it's about structure, and those structures you see in music as well. So so I do sort of feel that maths, I would say that, and I'm a mathematician and signed up for that. That I think maths is somehow underpinning everything around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just maybe some closing words before we go to the Q&A. So we've covered a lot of ground: AI, math, creativity, and now games. Do you have any final closing words? What's how to thread the needle through all these topics?
Well, I suppose mathematics is that thread for me that always, I'm always interested in where the mathematics is in a story. So whether it's in games or talking about music, for example. But for me, I think, I always like a new challenge. So I always like to try and do something. So I wrote, as you mentioned in the introduction, a couple of plays, and even performed in one of them. So I've got a new play out, which is about Andre Weil and Bourbaki. And I think for me, that's I always try and offer myself a new challenge. And I think that's why actually machine learning and AI is a very powerful tool for a creative, because I think as humans, we often get stuck in a rut and just repeat things that we've done successfully before. And I think that often we need just something to jolt us out of repeating old behaviors. And I think AI is nicely offering that. It can take, for example, a jazz musician's output, learn from that, and then offer back something new that you can do with that. So I think that's quite exciting. The AI is being a helpful tool in our creativity by stopping us behaving like machines and saying, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you combine these two things, maths and cooking or something? That'll be interesting.
Okay. All right. That's great, Marcus. Let's go to the Q&A. There's a few questions we have here. So I'll read the first one from Randall. His question is mathematics capable of fully describing how the universe works? Will we need something more? Does using mathematics to describe the universe limit our creativity when attempting to understand it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, I mean, since my fundamental belief is that the universe is fundamentally mathematical, therefore I think that understanding the mathematics is what's going to give us an insight into the universe. However, there's a second component of this, which is our limitations as humans to understand that mathematics. So I think where the limitations will be is, for example, even just something like the Riemann hypothesis. One of our greatest fears is that although it's a theorem that we can state and understand the statement of the conjecture, maybe the proof has a complexity to it that it will be beyond the ability of the human mind to actually comprehend. And we already know in some ways from Gödel's incompleteness theorem that there are limitations about engaging with mathematics, that there will be true statements about numbers that within any system for mathematics we can't prove are true. So, if we actually set ourselves up a system of mathematics, we know that there are true statements that won't be able to be proved within there. So that kind of is interesting in respect of trying to understand kind of the implications for our universe, whether is there a kind of Gödel's incompleteness theorem? If we have any system which is describing the universe, there will be necessarily things about the universe which then translate into statements which we can't prove true. So we've already, maths is very weirdly powerful in proving its own limitations in some ways. And of course there are questions about the universe. I mean, whether the universe is infinite or not is a really interesting question, because obviously relativity tells us there's a cosmic horizon beyond which we can't see, and the accelerating expansion of the universe means actually the universe is being pushed over that cosmic horizon faster than it's increasing. So we're kind of losing information. So So the only way I could imagine, for example, proving the universe is infinite is kind of like we proved the irrationality of the square root of 2. Suppose it's not, and then get a contradiction, and therefore, a finite universe would have to contradict how we regard the universe as set up. So that's actually one of my previous books, which Randall might be interested in, which is called What We Cannot Know. So I was interested in what are the limitations of science. Science is all powerful in being able to describe so many things, and maths. But might there be questions that by their very nature are unanswerable, like consciousness, for example? Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." He was making a statement. The only thing I'm really certain of is my own consciousness. But maybe Tim, you've constructed a wonderful avatar that's talking to me, and you're relaxing on the beach somewhere. Maybe I'm an avatar. How do we know? So, and I think weirdly, that's why I think our creativity, was a tool that we developed early on as a species to explore what our own consciousness is like, whether it was anything like yours. Is your pain anything like my pain? And I think going forward, as AI becomes more and more sophisticated, I think there will be a moment when it will become conscious, and we will need to know when that happens. But its consciousness is going to be very different from our own. But I think that asking it to create things might, write its novel, paint a painting, write music, might give us that first inkling of when that, weird phase change will happen.
Great, thank you, Marcus. So I'll go to the next question, which is from Vicky. What are some teaching practices, moves that in your experience have been successful in communicating to adult and younger students the creativity and struggle that doing mathematics can often entail?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it relates to a real problem we have basically in secondary school education, where once we move to secondary school about age 11 or 12, suddenly these barriers go up between the subjects. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier about, the power of getting scientists to talk to each other cross disciplines. I really wish in school, and this is how often I will try and tap into the creativity, mathematical creativity of a student that doesn't necessarily think they are mathematical at heart, is to try and use, say, music, for example, to do a combined class of music and mathematics, and to just show how mathematics can be very powerful in helping to create music, where music has some mathematics hidden inside it, or theatre. I did a play with a great theatre company here called Complicité, about Hardy and Ramanujan. Actually, it was called A Disappearing Number, and out of that we developed some workshops which we took around schools with, which we asked theatre teachers and maths teachers to come along to. So we actually, it was a condition that the theatre teacher had to bring a maths teacher with them. And many of them said it's the first time I've ever talked to the mathematicians in my school. But out of that, we developed some ways of embodying mathematical ideas, which really helped some kids who find the abstract ideas of mathematics really difficult. But by actually physicalizing the mathematics in either with like rhythm, clapping patterns or something like that, I found that was really helpful. So I've been pushing with our government actually to create a kind of second course in mathematics, which would be a kind of mathematics literature, the stories of mathematics. So I think the mathematics we teach our kids in school is very functional. It's utility driven. It's very boring. And why aren't we telling kids about prime numbers, about four-dimensional geometry, about topology, in different sorts of infinities? My kids, when they went through school in English, they learnt grammar, spelling, how to write a letter, but they also got exposed to Shakespeare and poetry, and I sort of feel we're missing out on giving students some of the really exciting mathematics that's out there. They only get to see that really late on in a university degree course. Why don't we be braver and actually try and bring up in some of these bigger ideas earlier on at school? And I think, kids don't understand Shakespeare completely. I still don't understand Shakespeare completely, but you get a taste for it and you think, okay, that's what I'd love to do. Or music. If I just did scales and arpeggios on my trumpet, I would have given it up very quickly. But because my teacher played me some jazz and I thought, that sounds kind of nice, I'd like to be able to play that. It sort of inspired me. So I think that's sort of what we're missing in mathematical education, which I think would be would really help people to find a way into the subject, when at the moment the way it's being taught really is putting a lot of people off.
Great, thank you, Marcus. Another question, also from Randall. I loved the story of maths. Do you have any more documentary series in the works?
Well, actually, there are a lot of other documentaries that I've made, which perhaps you can find. One is called The Code, which is a 3-part series I made for the BBC, which was sort of looking at the idea of the code underlying the universe is mathematical. And we actually went to visit Google a few times during that series to see how you're using maths to kind of spot patterns in data behavior. So there's that series. And then I have a few puzzle shows that I do with a comedian here in England called Dara O'Brien, called The School of Hard Sums. So that might be worth looking for. And also some Horizons, which is our science documentary series here in the UK. So I've done quite a few on things like fractals or consciousness or intelligence, and also radio. So I have a SoundCloud which has a lot of radio shows that I've made, including another one about history, which is called A Brief History of Mathematics. And I took 10 of my favorite mathematicians and did a little bit about their biography, but also the kind of impact of their work on today's kind of practice in kind of weird areas. So, for example, Fourier, and we talked to Brian Eno about how he uses kind of Fourier's work to create interesting new instruments, for example. So, and another series that people might like is one which was called The Beauty of Diagrams. So it was like 6 programs about different iconic diagrams, from Vitruvian Man through to the DNA diagram in the Nature paper that Crick and Watson made. And in fact, that's one of the shortcuts I talk about in this book, is actually about diagrams, the power of diagrams to kind of crystallize a mathematical problem or physical problem. And you think about in physics, Feynman diagrams, amazing tool, a shortcut to understanding hugely complex integrals, which before we had that sort of diagram technology, were really difficult to navigate. So that's another series you might look out for. But at the moment, I'm really enjoying kind of doing live. I really enjoy the interaction. Maybe it's having spent on Zoom over the pandemic. I'm really enjoying going and talking to live audiences. So doing my play at the moment, and doing quite a lot of musical stuff as well. So yeah, look out for that. Maybe we'll bring the play. We're hoping to take the play around the world. So maybe we'll come to wherever you are when you're watching this.
Great. We have another question from Frank. Can you tell us about some of your favorite things in books that we see behind you?
All right. Yes, this isn't a fake background. Yeah, some people say, "Wow, you've got a great Zoom background." So yeah, I'm an avid reader of books, not just science books, but so a lot of these are kind of the novels I enjoy. One novel in particular, which actually made it into my games book, because it's about a game I sort of think I've been playing for the last, I don't know, 50 years, whatever, or 40 years. It's called The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse. I think that's up there somewhere. This is a futuristic book about a game that this kind of monastic order play, where they try and synthesize ideas of mathematics, music, history, culture. And the game is kind of played by almost telling a story using all of these things. And I read that when I was a student, and it made me kind of want to play that game. And so it sounded very like mathematics, and it sounded very much like being in the ivory tower of academia, this monastic order that play the game. So in some ways, I think I've been trying to play that game ever since. So you might see some prime numbers up here. They were used in a program I made, actually based on my first book, The Music of the Primes, that we made and I think that's available somewhere on the internet, telling the story of prime numbers. There are also some books up there. I helped a children's author, Lauren Child. She had this wonderful series of books about a child girl spy called Ruby Redford, but she said she needed somebody to come up with all the codes and kind of puzzles that Ruby would, because she's a children's novelist. She kind of needed a geek to help her. So I was called up, and so I created all of these crazy puzzles and codes, which are in this series of Ruby Redford books, which are kind of aimed at 11, 12, 13-year-olds. So if anyone's got children of that age, they're really great books, wonderful stories, but also got some good puzzles and codes to crack. So there's a little introduction to my background.
Okay, great. Well, I have a question, Marcus. So actually, we intersect in an interesting way in the world of science and social media. Last year, your former colleague and friend Eric Weinstein released his theory of everything in the sense of physics called geometric unity. You deserve some credit for that, since you were the first to give him some showtime at Oxford for inviting him to the Simonyi lectures back in 2013. The video of that lecture is now on YouTube and has over 600,000 views. But in any case, he finally released the paper last year, promoted it on Joe Rogan's podcast, Brian Keating's podcast, and I've earned some reputation for having refuted that work, and more recently the work he did with Pia Milani on economics. But what was interesting throughout this affair was to see how people decide whom to trust when there are technical controversies, especially when they're not qualified to evaluate them. In this case, Eric's manuscript versus my rebuttal, both involving highly technical gauge theory and physics. But really, this is really a symptom of a more greater problem in society that we have, which is that information is just flying by us all the time. And we're not often qualified to evaluate that. Our expertise is limited, and information is very noisy at times. And so my question to you, Marcus, is how do we develop shortcuts, heuristics for better thinking when things come our way that oftentimes, it's outside of our wheelhouse, and maybe it's true or false, who knows? Everything ranging from our colleague maybe claiming to revolutionize physics, or maybe a family member has gone down some conspiracy theory rabbit hole. How do you think about developing principles for knowing what kinds of information we can dismiss versus those we can allocate further attention to?
Yeah, I think it's a really important challenge. I mean, I think you're right. Sort of, who do you trust? So you trust certain members of the, university professors, for example, have a degree of trust, whilst a scientist working for a government organization has lower trust because there's nervousness about whether they're being controlled. So there is an interesting sort of balance, and I suppose Eric Weinstein came very much from outside of academia. So I spent some time reading that. I'm not an expert in this field, and so I'm really happy that people are starting to engage with it who have better skills than I do to assess this. But I saw that there was enough interesting stuff going on in it. Certainly the group theory there was interesting things that I thought were worth sharing with the world. So that's sort of why I sort of spent a little bit of my status on giving him a platform to share this, because I thought, it's because ultimately I think that the only way we're going to come to some understanding is by having a dialogue and it's sharing our ideas and talking through them. And I think that's the same really with you raise the interesting challenge of when some member of your family has sort of got hooked on, say, an anti-vax perspective. How do you try and argue with them to overturn their views on that? And I think it's really just digging down and trying to remove sort of confrontation and sort of sharing where those kind of thoughts are coming from. But I think we're getting to a level where in number theory we have an amazing theorem called a conjecture called the ABC conjecture, which Motozuki has come up with a proof. And actually we have lots of these stories. Perlman with the Poincare conjecture, originally very sparse notes that he offered, but it was only through, and I think probably there aren't shortcuts really beyond actually having to dig through the details of this. It's intricate, it's detailed, it's complex. Maybe there are no shortcuts, just the more people who explore these ideas find, maybe something's wrong, but maybe there's something we can do together, which there's enough ideas in here which if we change them it becomes something different. So I think collaboration is very important. I know from the collaborators that I work with that if I didn't have them, it's like having a ladder and I'm missing some rungs, and they have those rungs, and so together we can climb higher. So I think, you know, it's about finding the positives in what we're looking at, trying to find common ground, such that we aren't sort of always trying to. I mean, I think social media just unfortunately does encourage a sort of confrontational behavior, which, you know, maybe it'd be better to be offline and sort of share the ideas more constructively. So, you know, I think that one should be open to new ideas wherever they come from. After all, that was what Hardy did with Ramanujan. This crazy guy from, you know, the Port Authority in Madras sends some letters to mathematicians, turn them down, think it's just crazy because they don't have a trust in that. But Hardy took the risk and said, maybe there's something here, and invited him over. And you know, there were some really interesting things going on. So I think we should just be, you know, being a scientist is about being open to new ideas, but also combining that with a critical behavior to make sure you don't get carried away. So I think that's, you know, what we're looking for is always that sort of combined approach, good cop, bad cop approach.
I see. Great. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Marcus. And it was great having you here at Talks at Google. We definitely look forward to seeing your book and more coming out of you. And of course, we'll be talking more soon. I have a podcast about mathematics, and we'll be working together to produce some great content of mathematics.
Great. So it's been a really fascinating conversation. So thanks everyone for joining us.